controversy, but it's been 2 weeks since we chatted with you, so I did want to just get a sense from the inside the Beltway, sort of what the thought process is on what President Trump's trip overseas. I think I asked you letter grade. Of course, you're coming from the Democratic perspective, but how did he do abroad?
Well, I think the fact that the media are not even speaking about the trip very much demonstrates that it was overshadowed pretty substantially by this investigation. I would say that generally the first few days, the portion of the trip in the Middle East went far better for him than the remainder of the trip. There were not as many gaps, there were not as many slights, and there didn't seem to be as many problems, especially with our allies. But overall, I think it was pretty much a fail. The European leaders came away not having a better impression of Trump than they had before it began. And frankly, I think that some of the appeal in the Middle East turned people off. I mean, there's something tacky and unseemly about being so excited when you see your name and your portrait on the Ritz-Carlton, right? And I think that was the sort of highlight that Trump found in the Middle East. So, I don't think this is the kind of trip that the administration is going to, they'll tout it, but I don't think it's one that they're going to be able to claim credit for as far as Democrats are concerned.
And moments, as we know, kind of can live on in infamy. The Pushgate with the Montenegro official. I mean, does people just chalk that up as Trump being Trump, or does it encapsulate to folks sort of the Trump presidency?
Well, I think people that are already disinclined to like the Trump presidency now have a visual. But keep in mind, too, that it wasn't only the push. It's when you see all of the G7 leaders walking down the street and Donald Trump is following in a golf cart. It's when he shakes the hand of the French president and it's clear that something more is going on and that he's not planning on letting go. He's going to demonstrate his strength. Even the meeting with the Pope, I don't know if you've seen, there are these memes where the Pope is always happy and go lucky, and the headshot with Trump, he's just kind of grimacing. And, this is not the kind of PR that you want. The other thing I would note that I'm particularly attentive to here is the fact that Melania Trump wore a $51,000 jacket on the trip, which is more than the median income in the United States. And I remember 4 or 5 years ago talking about Ann Romney's $900 shirt, which at the time was seen as demonstrating a tone deafness to what the middle of the country was facing and dealing with. And I feel like that photo is going to be something that the Democrats are going to be able to really move and push forward, because it highlights how removed from the people suffering from income inequality Donald Trump really is.
And do you think a lot of times, especially in this media world in which we live, again, the trip abroad are just encapsulated in moments, the G7 picture, the picture with the Pope, the picture with Melania's jacket. Does that oftentimes overshadow the more substantive issues that belie what was actually taking place?
Those things do overshadow, but I think it's important to keep in mind, too, that if we ask the G7 leaders, okay, so when you think back on this trip, where do you stand? Where does the United States stand? That's not a message that the U.S. is that excited to hear either, right? Like, basically, our European allies are saying, well, I guess the United States can't be the center of the universe anymore. And so in this case, I'm not sure that the superficial snapshots are really overshadowing good news or overshadowing what would be a positive story for the Trump administration.
So let's circle back now that we're back with the president here in the country. Let's talk about Kushnergate. Basically everything that's going on about his relationship and ties to Russian, both business leaders, even more so than officials. What do we expect, and what's the talk down there? Just how significant could this be?
Well, for the Democrats, this is very, very significant. For the Republicans, it's completely nothing. These are just typical back channels that everybody engages in, and we shouldn't really think that much about it. I mean, anybody that watched any of the Sunday morning shows this week or has been watching any of this political coverage sees surrogates from the administration basically tying themselves in knots, trying to suggest that what Kushner did is old hat and that every administration does this. I think 2 things are important here. The first is that Mueller has only been investigating now for a little more than a week, and the investigation is clearly well underway. He's staffing up, and he's subpoenaing people, and he's also obviously pushing forward in a very broad way, which is not the best news for the administration. The other thing, and this I don't think has been getting enough attention, is that Jared Kushner, through his lawyers, has said that he's happy to answer any questions, and that he's not a target of the investigation, he's just a witness in the investigation. So it might be the case that it's not appropriate for him to remain in the White House, we don't know. But at this point, in fairness to Kushner, he hasn't refused to say anything. He hasn't engaged in the same kinds of tactics that Michael Flynn has.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, as Republicans trying to downplay it, saying this is just typical of any administration, is there a legal line of which he could or could not be talking with folks from different countries of different levels of influence? If it doesn't rise to the level of something that could border on anything even perceived to be criminal. But what's the outcome for Jared? Does he stay the course? Does he stay in the inside circle? And is that ultimately a call by the president himself?
Well, the line is treason, right? Like, and the question is, did he engage in treasonous behavior? Because we have to remember that when these conversations took place, although Kushner was still a private citizen, the Obama administration was still conducting foreign policy, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like there was this vacuum and Kushner was stepping in to fill it. The Obama administration was still in power. And so that's the big question here. The problem is, for Donald Trump, loyalty. And he has created a situation where some people would say that it's nepotism, some people would say that it's just a demonstration of how important loyalty is. What do you then do when you would ordinarily be inclined to let that person go, and you can't because he's your son-in-law? So I don't know what's going to happen. What we've heard already is the White House doubling down, saying that Kushner has done nothing wrong, which is the script that they keep returning to. But once Kushner speaks, whether through his lawyer or himself, he has anytime you talk to the FBI, you're basically in danger of perjuring yourselves. So this is a situation where they can't really talk around the facts anymore.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You mentioned about his Kushner's talks while the Obama administration was still in office. What bubbles to the level of treason?
Again, there are partisan answers to this question, which demonstrates how bad things have really gotten, right?
Yes.
As far as the Republicans are concerned, nothing is treasonous. You can say anything that you want. Back channels are used all the time. According to the Democrats, no. Back channels are used for hostage negotiations or to figure out how you're going to move forward with good relations with a nation within the administration, not against it. So I think a lot of this is going to come down to how zealous the prosecution winds up being. And frankly, if this is still going on in 2018, whether the Democrats take back the House, because how investigative these committees want to be depends largely on their composition.
And let's talk a little bit, you talk about what's coming out of the White House, resignation of the communications director. Did we expect this?
I didn't expect it to be him. I was expecting some, we've been talking about these shakeups. We've been talking about McGahn and Sean Spicer and maybe even Kellyanne Conway. Nobody was really talking about the newly hired communications director. So I don't know if this was Trump deciding that he doesn't like the way news is going, or this guy saying, this is just a bad fit. But this isn't the name that we were thinking of. And so it's a shakeup, but I don't think it rises to the level of anything that's dramatic, because we don't really know.
We just didn't know enough about Michael. And let's talk about the return of Sean Spicer to the briefing room after the president's trip abroad. Again, this continued focus and allegations of fake news. What's the talk inside the Beltway about that? Anything that the president disagrees with is fake news, legitimate fake news, and are we just going to continue to talk about fake news?
Well, the president's tweets over the course of the last couple of days demonstrate now not only that fake news is prevalent, but that fake news is the bane of his existence, and it's what's making America not great again. So I think that this is the narrative that is going to continue. The problem is that the press have really demonstrated that they're just not willing to accept this. And in some ways, every time Sean Spicer talks about fake news, every time the president talks about fake news, that creates incentives for the media to demonstrate how unfake their news actually is. And at the end of the day, it just doesn't do the administration any favors. The other thing I would note that's a little bit surprising about Spicer returning to the podium is that he suffered a pretty substantial snub on the trip, in that as a very religious practicing Catholic, he was denied an audience with the Pope. He was not included in that group. And, that was read initially as Trump sending a clear signal that he's on his way out, but that didn't happen.
That was just a signal. Again, we talk week to week, and a lot of times there's some domestic policy that we discuss, a lot of times overshadowed by international affairs and investigations. Do you see that as being the case down in D.C. right now? The Trump budget that was put forth, what's the talk on that?
There is no talk. So there's no talk on the budget, there's no talk on healthcare. Basically, the talk is that now the end of the summer isn't even the goalpost. What they're talking about is Congress is in session for 2 years, and you really have 24 months to get a lot of this stuff done. So, if you can accomplish a few things in 6 to 9 months, that's great, but it's really a 2-year trajectory. So I think that members are well aware of the fact that when they come back and they're in recess for the next several weeks, they're going to be mired in the muck of these investigations.
And let's talk a little bit about the politics and the governance of D.C. One of your former colleagues, Darrell West, had mentioned just a couple weeks ago the lack of appointments by Trump to levels within the government to be actually where they need to be. He said it was something around 5 or 10%. Is there any concern inside the Beltway of positions not being filled?
Well, there's concern in that it's difficult to figure out how an administration can run a government when it's not working at full capacity. Now, it's not unheard of to have large portions of positions not filled, and it's not unheard of to take 6 months or 9 months or even a year to fully staff up. But the small number of posts that have been filled, coupled with the fact that there are all of these other tentacles distracting Trump from naming people, let alone having them confirmed, is, I think, somewhat worrisome. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that a lot of these positions are the positions where it's the people doing the actual day-to-day work. And as long as those positions are vacant, the work of government becomes that much more difficult to accomplish.
Anything that have to do with, Trump coming in and running as a Republican, sort of as an outsider within the Republican Party, doesn't necessarily come armed with that full set of maybe apparatus and acolytes to sort of be rewarding sort of favors to. How have you seen that play out by him coming into the White House as an outsider?
Well, I wouldn't say that there have not been favors paid. Betsy DeVos is clearly Secretary of Education because she was a mega donor in the campaign. She clearly has no education experience. Now, that's not to say that previous presidents haven't done this. Barack Obama rewarded people with Plum ambassadorships. Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich. George W. Bush had sleepovers at the White House for $100,000. This is not something that is unheard of, but cabinet posts and those kinds of appointments generally are. So Trump does have a group of people on whom to rely. I just think that the same way that he thinks about business and how it's not necessary to make sure that every single position is staffed, smaller businesses might be smarter, he thinks that way about government. And there's just too much work to be done to have it function at 10% capacity.
So here we are. It's the 30th. Have you been watching House of Cards?
That's what I'm doing tonight.
I thought you were going to be like, I'm taking a break right now. No spoilers. I appreciate it. Where are you going to be keeping an eye on in the coming week, Jennifer?
The investigation and basically what else winds up either getting leaked or explicitly stated from Mueller's inquiries. So I think that's where we're all going to be, where all eyes will be for the next week or two.
All eyes inside the Beltway on the investigation taking place. President Trump ties to Russia. Jennifer Lawless, as always, appreciate your Skyping in. Hopefully we'll see you in studio soon when you make a trip back up to Rhode Island.
I hope so. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer Lawless.